Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. In this session on the role of religion in society, we will get an opportunity to contemplate the role of Islam in modern society and the challenges faced by Muslim citizens to actualize their demands for Islamic ways of life, both in the private and public spheres in the West as well as in Muslim-majority countries. Today, we are pleased to welcome three very special guests for our panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Joseph Lambert from Hamad bin Khalifa University, Doha. Dr. Lambert is Associate Professor of Quranic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies in Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is specialized in the fields of Quranic Studies, Islamic thought, Islamic philosophical thought, and Sufism. Our second speaker for this session is Dr. Jonathan Brown from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. He is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His research interests include a wide range of fields such as Hadith, Islamic law, Salafism, Sufism, Islamic legal theory, and pre-Islamic poetry. Our third speaker for today is Dr. Lu'ay Safi from Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar. Dr. Safi is a professor of political science at the College of Islamic Studies in Hamad bin Khalifa University and senior fellow at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding. His wide range of publications include Islam and Democracy, Transitions in the Muslim World, The Challenge of Modernity, and the Quranic Narrative. And today we will be starting with Dr. Lambert. He will be sharing with us his paper on Islam and Postmodernity, a view from traditional epistemology, in which he articulates the epistemic colonization of Eurocentric systems of knowledge and how the classical Islamic intellectual tradition can address this form of intellectual hegemony. With that, I ask you that you give your full attention to Dr. Lambert. The floor is yours, Professor.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. All right, so this is on. Good. Alhamdulillah. All right. I want to thank everyone for coming here. I want to especially thank Dr. Al-Aryan and the university and all of the volunteers who have made this event possible. For me, we're halfway into it, but it's been a wonderful opportunity to hear many ideas and stimulate my own thinking about many of these topics. And I hope that I am able to make some small contribution in this way as well. I want to begin with a quote, which I'm not really going to integrate into this, but it's actually a quote that I often say to my students when I'm teaching as a white guy from America, teaching Arab heritage to Arabs in the Arab world, which is very strange. But one of the quotes that I begin with is I tell them that there's this famous quote by George Orwell. He says, "The most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." That's the end of the quote. I would add to that also their own understanding of their texts and of their textual traditions. Now, from the revelation of the Quran until today, a central concern of Muslims has been the question of how the human being can discern right from wrong, truth from falsehood. God says of the Quran that it is tibyanan li kulli shay, a clarification for all things. Of course, there's the famous line that we hear over and over again, truth has come, falsehood has vanished, falsehood is ever bound to vanish. From a Quranic perspective, it could be said that ignorance is our greatest foe and knowledge our greatest need. For when applied and lived, knowledge provides what is necessary to overcome spiritual, moral, emotional, and even political and physical decrepitude. As Rosalind Gwynn has demonstrated in Logic, Rhetoric, and Legal Reasoning in the Quran does not simply assert its teachings and enjoin one to follow, but provides detailed syllogistic arguments for its central teachings and injunctions. And as Bernard Weiss observes, in Islam, knowledge is central to our covenantal relationship with God. Quote, "To know God is to know him as a presence before whom one stands in a covenantal relationship. There is no other way to know God." End quote. And we are all familiar with many of the ahadith that enjoin seeking knowledge. Now, from the time of the revelation until today, Muslims have thus sought knowledge in all its forms. We need not review the myriad contributions of medieval Muslim scholars in so many domains here. There's ample scholarship regarding this, and as regards the modern period, there are new studies such as Ahmed Daraw's Islam, Science, and the Challenge of History, and Marie Scheffer-Mosenon's Science Among the Ottomans. But the historical record is not my concern for this lecture. What I wish to focus upon is a classical Islamic paradigm that, in following upon the Quranic and prophetic injunctions, made knowledge central to Islamic civilizations from Africa to Indonesia. While there were multiple disciplines and countless subdisciplines, the various subjects and fields of classical Islamic learning stood, as Wael Halak has put it, in a particular relationship to one another, one that could be said to have a cohesive structure in which cross-fertilization was routine, end quote. Central to this cohesion was a Quranic paradigm of knowledge that leads towards God and establishes everything in a balance, the mizan, or what Naqib al-Atas refers to here as hikmah, leading towards justice. Central to the maintenance of this paradigm and the pursuit of knowledge was and is the question of epistemology and of noetics. Here I distinguish between epistemology and noetics because of the distinctly character that the word epistemology has in the contemporary context. Knowledge is not only a question of what one knows, but of how one knows, what one knows, and what modes of knowledge can be considered to provide legitimate forms of knowledge. Epistemology and noetics were thus central concerns of Muslim scholars from the beginning of the theological debates regarding the nature of God, the nature of the sinner, the ontological status of the Quran, etc. Epistemology and noetics have therefore been analyzed in a dialectical manner from the time of Al-Kindi up to the present. Central to these discussions has always been the question of the relationship between revelation and reason, as stated by some, and the relationship among revelation, wahi, reason, and inspiration, ilham or kashf, unveiling, as stated by others. In the pre-modern period, this debate was most fully developed by Muslim thinkers because the recognition of prophethood as a phenomenon experienced by all human collectivities is something that was, in a sense, in the nature of human beings to experience, made it so that people had to, in a sense, answer the question not just of how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew and received revelation, but of how the whole phenomena of revelation itself worked. Since this time, the desire to reconcile prophetic knowledge with philosophical investigation has led to robust epistemologies, wherein prophetic inspiration or unveiling and philosophical investigation, with all of the various manifestations attached to it, have been conceptualized as various modes of knowing God and of knowing God's creation. This is one of the reasons why you might pick up a medieval, you might even pick up a medieval mathematical text or an astronomical text or chemistry text, and it will begin talking about how this form of knowledge is actually a way of contemplating God by contemplating God's creation and by contemplating the ayat Allah fil afaki wa fi anfusihim. Here, I do not have time to review all of the unique modes of epistemology from Al-Farabi to Al-Ghazali to Ibn Rushd, Ibn Arabi, Suhrawardi, Nasiruddin Tusi, Mullah Sadra, etc., bequeathed to us by the classical tradition. There are, however, a few central characteristics that they have in common, the absence of which can be found in many expressions of Islam in the contemporary period. Foremost among these is an acknowledgement of the transcendent, and thus an acknowledgement that any theory of knowing must account for knowledge that comes from on high, al-ilm al-laduni, be it through revelation or through inspiration, the former always being recognized, that is, revelation always being recognized as superior to inspiration. Second among these characteristics is that refined thinking allows one to discern between truth and falsehood no matter whose tongue or pen articulates it. As Ali bin Abi Talib is reported to have said, "Do not know truth through men, know truth and then you will know its people." As Al-Ghazali says in commenting upon this saying, which he's quite fond of and cites in at least 4 texts that I know of, he says, "Those with weak minds know truth by men, not men by truth." He then advises that one learn to sift truth from falsehood and likens this process to that of a money changer who does not reject everything a counterfeiter brings outright, but instead uses his knowledge of true currency and false currency to sort the good from the bad and make use of the good. As Afifi al-Aqiti observes, this position, in a sense, he says, encapsulates Al-Ghazali's method, wherein, quote, "Each science, even each theory, should be evaluated on its own merits. In that way, even a science that is normally stigmatized as impious can be of benefit whenever it is correct." Such discernment is not only a question of how we know and what we know, it is also a question of what we are. As Abu Hamid al-Ghazali writes, "Knowledge is the end destined for man and his special characteristic for which he was created." As he puts it in the Book of Knowledge of the Ihya, "The intellect is the noblest attribute the human being possesses, since through it one agrees to take on God's trust, and by it one achieves proximity to God. The science of how we know is thus directly related to the science of what we are and the manner in which we achieve our final ends." Allusion to this could be said to be seen in the several ahadith wherein the Prophet ﷺ is asked who is the most intelligent of people. And he said it is those who contemplate, who remember death much. From this perspective, an absence of epistemologies that are grounded in the classical Islamic tradition and conversant with the classical tradition has radical implications for Islamic civilization as a whole and for our individual relationship with God and for our final ends. Yet, as many contemporary Muslim thinkers such as Naqib al-Attas, Taha Abdul Rahman, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr have observed, in the face of the challenges posed by Western domination, intellectual reform movements of all stripes have at times undermined Islamic civilization more than supported it by failing to analyze the forms of knowledge that they were adopting. They thus relied upon epistemologies that are not simply foreign to classical Islamic epistemologies, but even opposed to them, because these modes of knowledge are grounded in a paradigm or paradigms that deny the very idea of the transcendent. In the analysis of al-Attas, adopting foreign epistemological paradigms and seeking to graft them into Islam leads to a situation wherein, quote, "We have weak Muslims and weak and dangerous leaders whose comprehension and knowledge of Islam is stunted to the level of immaturity. And because of this, Islam itself is erroneously made to appear as if undeveloped or misdeveloped or left to stagnate," end quote. What Attas refers to here is a loss of epistemic confidence, which leads many Muslims to seek epistemic models that do not appear to be too Islamic. That is, models that allow for some space for Muslim thinkers without offending the sensibilities of our Euro-American epistemological overlords, for whom white makes right. This leads to a truncated perception of our intellectual traditions that results from and perpetuates subconscious submission to the epistemic sovereignty of the West, a submission which is necessary for inclusion in its power structures. As Hami Bahaba puts it, Orientalism does not allow for native agency. The native is thus only given or allowed a voice once they have been culturally, ideologically, and epistemically conscripted. Once conscripted, individuals are then allowed to have a stage or a voice, so long as it can be said to be seen as contributing to the continuing production of epistemologically and politically domesticated and pacified subjects. If you want to see what happens when an unconscripted voice is deemed to have become too loud, then look at our brother Tariq Ramadan. I don't have any judgment on the charges against him, but the way he's being treated is an example of this. Now, being epistemically conscripted into a paradigm that recognizes the sovereignty of Euro-America epistemologies leads in turn to epistemic erosion, where, as a civilization, we are no longer able to think for ourselves, but must employ paradigms from outside or even conceptualize our place in the world. This state of affairs is the result of a persistent and systemic assault on the epistemic viability of the classical Islamic intellectual tradition, or I should say traditions in the plural. The first stages of these attacks were from the outside. If you want to see a classical example of it, look at Ernst Renan. I mean, the whole thing. He just goes and tears apart every part of the Islamic intellectual tradition. The details of these attacks are in areas as diverse as Quranic studies and Islamic philosophy have been addressed by many scholars. The overarching ethos has been discussed in detail by Edward Said and a host of others. What I wish to address here is the process of conscription whereby many Muslims become complicit in undermining their own traditions. Muslims of all stripes, especially those in the vaunted halls of academia, know that they must adhere to a system that recognizes the epistemic sovereignty of the secular Euro-American paradigm. Citing classical Islamic thinkers is all well and good, but must be done within an epistemic framework which makes these scholars second-class citizens at best. And it is an underlying premise of the modern Euro-American academy, or we could say a creed in the religion of progress, that non-Western epistemologies are fit to be an object of investigation or analysis, but are not fit to be the tools of analysis through which we might understand texts, through which we might understand the world and our place in the world, or, God forbid, through which we might analyze dominant Eurocentric epistemologies. In the Islamic context, once this paradigm is adopted, the various disciplines of the classical tradition are then conceptualized through foreign categories that deny the cohesive cross-fertilization among fields and subfields that characterized classic Islamic learning. For example, the deep integration of Sufism and Sharia as two fields that defined the moral outlook of Islamic societies is not only ignored, but actively denied, to the point that the mention of Sufism remains anathema in many circles, and even when allowed, must be denied any epistemic validity. By viewing our traditions through foreign paradigms, Muslim intellectuals participate in and perpetuate their own epistemic and hermeneutic marginalization. The result is an epistemic humiliation that has dire consequences for Muslim societies. Many of us have in effect adopted the residual prejudices of modernity. In her book on epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker identifies residual prejudice as a situation wherein one has so deeply adopted societal norms that one may hold prejudicial images and presuppositions alongside conflicting beliefs. It's a most insidious form of prejudice because it creates a situation where the oppressed view themselves through the lens of their oppressors and thus act in ways that perpetuate their own oppression. And here Fricker is actually borrowing these from studies in feminist studies, where they've shown how women sometimes so much adopt these paradigms that they don't even believe other women when they come out with stories of abuse and things along these lines. Now, Among many Muslim thinkers and academics, we witness a residual internalization of foreign epistemic norms that influences our perception of our own intellectual traditions. Through this residual internalization, many Muslims perceive themselves through the lens of oppressive ideologies. Some directly support that ideology, seeing any intrusion of Islam into the public sphere as evidence of extremism. Others support it subliminally, even though that ideology does not accord with their beliefs. This subliminal internalization then serves to maintain and perpetuate systemic institutional injustices, wherein the epistemic authority of most modes of thought are evaluated based upon whether or not they originate from the West, adhere to Western paradigms, or can at least be made to appear to be in accordance with these paradigms. This type of intellectual culture creates a dynamic wherein the epistemic authority of methodologies and epistemologies of Euro-American origin have what's referred to as a credibility excess, while methodologies and epistemologies from the Islamic world have a credibility deficit. And a real epistemic transformation requires that we confront these residual prejudices within ourselves, within our educational institutions, and within society at large. Until and unless we do so, we remain active participations in our own hermeneutic marginalization. This leads to a situation where many Muslims feel alienated from anything that is consonant with the classical Islamic paradigm and experience a sense of hermeneutical gloom when seeking to countenance their own traditions in the contemporary context, or seeking to apply the observations of classical Muslim thinkers to the exigencies of the contemporary condition. Such marginalization is a form of what Anga Nayran refers to as epistemic colonization, where methodologies or forms of knowledge that post viable alternatives to Eurocentric epistemologies are impoverished and ghettoized, while other forms of knowledge are obliterated or curtailed until any epistemic challenge they may present to dominant epistemologies can be comfortably confined to the condition of artifacts to be displayed in a museum or in an academic subfield as examples of so-called traditional knowledge. Those who then seek to reassert the primacy or even validity of modes of interpretation by which non-Western peoples understand themselves, their histories, and their texts, and through which they present themselves to others, are then said to be naive, and they are labeled as apologists, as essentialists, as traditionalists, as romantics, or whatever the disparaging term of the day may be. Now, my hope is ultimately that through universities such as this, through centers such as this, through places such as the one I work, the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa, that we can actually develop ways to counter the hermeneutical marginalization of classical Islamic paradigms and move towards epistemological paradigms that are cognizant of the contributions of non-Muslim civilizations and dialogue with them, but do not enter into this dialogue from a position of epistemic subordination. Thank you very much.